Welcome, everyone. This is another episode of Conversations on Anarres. I'm your host. I'm Joseph Orozco, the co-director of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures. The Anarres Project is a forum for conversations, discussions, initiatives, projects that try to envision a future free of domination, exploitation, war, and empire. And on this program, Conversations on Anarres, we talk with different scholars, artists, and organizers who are trying through their own work to make such a future possible. I'm really excited today for today's episode. I have Dr. David Seitz, who has written an exciting new book about the radicalness of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, one of my favorite series in the Star Trek universe. And I've asked him to come and talk a little bit about his book. Dr. David Seitz is an associate professor of cultural geography at Harvey Mudd College in California. And the new book that he has written is entitled A Different Trek, Radical Geographies of Deep Space Nine. So, we were talking just a little bit before. I'm so excited to talk with you. I got this book on pre-order earlier this year. I was really looking forward to it. So many of the themes that you talk about meshed with some of the themes that I wrote in my own book on Star Trek. So I felt that you were a kindred soul, at least in the Trek academic Trek universe, and so I'm excited to talk with you about this book. But with all sort of Trek academics that I interview or talk to on the program, I often ask the sort of personal relationship to Star Trek. So you've written this new book, A Different Trek, but I wanted to ask how you first got interested in studying Star Trek. So there, on the one hand, there's the question about like, what's your relationship personally to Star Trek? But then how did you start getting into an academic study of this? And so, are you a fan of science fiction in general first? And then what brings you to Star Trek in particular?
Mm, I would say that I am generally a fan of science fiction. I'm admittedly not as widely read as I could be, but I'm a huge consumer of science fiction screen media, and it's often the screen media that will then impel me to go back and read, novels or novelizations. I grew up watching Star Trek: The Next Generation with my father when it was on the air, and then watching Voyager with my sister when it was on the air. I think, the strong women on that show were very compelling for my sister as a little girl, and for me as sort of a proto-queer child. Um, and then, when Enterprise came along, I really tried, and I kind of lost interest. I think it felt reactionary, even to me as kind of a liberal growing up in the suburbs of Milwaukee in the early 2000s. And by college, I kind of came to see Star Trek as a sort of embarrassingly reactionary attachment. I kept up with the movies, but there's some Ebert review, it might be of Nemesis or Insurrection, where he talks about the feeling of the whole thing being out of gas, and I didn't want him to be right, but I kind of felt like he was. And then the summer after I graduated from college and I was getting ready to go to graduate school because, I graduated from college in 2010. It was a recession. Like, what else were you going to do to avoid paying back your student loans? I was sort of consuming two texts in their entirety alongside each other. So during the day, I was gradually working my way through Jesbir Puar's really important book, Terrorist Assemblages, about the cultural politics of the War on Terror. And then at night, I decided to do a DS9 rewatch from start to finish. And that show just I'd seen part of it as it was finishing, but it's sort of hard when you're in the middle of something, especially something that's serialized, to really appreciate what's going on. And DS9 just blew me away. And I did a rewatch of it with a friend of mine, Mick Carter, who's a Bajan Canadian fashion designer and who's really interested in queer cultures and Afrofuturisms. And so we just had a really rich dialogue about the show. And then when I got this job at a liberal arts STEM institution, where there was lots of interest in popular science fiction, Harvey Mudd College, it gave me the opportunity to really think about not only teaching with Star Trek, but making Star Trek more prominent in my research agenda, because the course kind of gave me a laboratory for working through some of my ideas about it. So, Jerry Canavan teaches us that Star Trek's big idea, insofar as something that big can have a big idea because it's so vast, is that the future might be good, and that we ourselves might be good. And so I think if you're interested in futures without domination and exploitation, as you are on this podcast, and as I also am, as a leftist, I think Star Trek offers one decidedly imperfect and even incoherent, but nevertheless important way or set of ways to think about how we might go about getting there.
Yeah, that's great. And I do want to explore with you a little bit this question about the vision of the future in Star Trek. I wanted to ask, do you teach classes at Harvey Mudd that utilize Star Trek as a text?
Yeah, so every spring, all the faculty in my department, which is like a broad liberal arts department at the college, we all teach at least one section of a first year research and writing course called Critical Inquiry, but we each get to put our own little spin on it. So, often with faculty teaching core courses, it feels like a chore because you're teaching outside your area, but our institution affords us quite a bit of autonomy. So I sometimes call this class Star Trek and Social Theory. Sometimes I'm a little bit less cryptic and I'll call it Star Trek, Race, Gender, and Class. And for the first 6 weeks, I paired different episodes with different sort of critical theory texts, whether that's queer theory, Marxist theory, critical race theory, feminist theory, so on and so forth. And then we spend the rest of the semester inviting them to develop their own allegorical readings of sort of social commentary and popular science fiction. And so that course has been wonderful. The students in that have been wonderful. I've learned quite a bit from them. They bring a lot of questions about gender identity, about sexuality and asexuality, about disability. And then we kind of think together about, okay, well, where do those meet up with these macro level structures like race, like class, like the gender division of labor. So I think I'll continue to offer that course as long as I keep doing research on Star Trek, which I will be for at least another few years. So.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that theme too with you. One thing I wanted to ask you, I often ask different Trek academics this question: do your students know Star Trek? Because I teach a class also too, and have for a number of years, and I find very few of my students know of Star Trek, and the ones that do usually have a story that begins like the one you just had. I used to watch it with my ex, right? My father, my mother, someone or other. So there's like this familial tie. For a lot of Trekkies, that it's a family kind of thing, or their family brought it into them in some way. But do your students have any kind of connection to Star Trek nowadays?
Yeah, it's interesting because when I was sort of touring to promote this book, I noticed how uneven that was across different institutions. Because I am at a STEM school, I would say that like at least a third in any given iteration of the Star Trek class are there because they are Star Trek fans. So it has much more of a live presence than it does, I think, on other college and university campuses where it might be more of a niche attachment. And I've spoken with faculty at other institutions who've wanted to teach on Star Trek more, but found it wasn't enough of a draw for their students. So I feel quite lucky to be kind of ensconced in the institutional environment I find myself in that regard. I don't know if it would be as possible to do the kind of work that I've done if I weren't, I mean, it's obviously, you work at OSU and you've written a wonderful book on Star Trek, so it's still possible, but I'm really grateful for the enthusiasm I get from students. I would say that when I first started the course, Star Trek was the main draw. And since I've, developed a reputation on campus, I think probably about half the students are there for Star Trek, and about half of them are actually there to some extent or another for the critical theory component. And for the past few years, I've just been teaching from Voyager because in 6 weeks, it's for students to get to know all of the characters. So it's easier to just stick with one series. And because Voyager is the first Star Trek that really passes the Bechdel test, I
Mm.
found that improves the gender balance of the course quite a bit. Like I think the first time I offered the Star Trek course, it was like two-thirds cisgender men. And once I started offering Voyager, it moved in the other direction, actually. Or sometimes it ends up around 50-50.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think we'll have to hold on to another conversation about the ethics of teaching Star Trek, and different series like that, because I have some thoughts about that as well in terms of how to present Star Trek to students. But what, that's I'll save that for a different discussion and bring in maybe some other voices so that we can talk. But something that I wanted to ask you too. Then, so you started saying that your formative experiences with Star Trek were of Next Generation. But your book is primarily DS9. So here's the dreaded question. Do you have a favorite series in the Star Trek universe?
Oh my goodness. Well, I mean, I think DS9 broke the mold in some ways that, were worthwhile enough that I wanted to dedicate a number of years of my life to writing a book about it. So I think that kind of outs me as liking DS9 the best. But I'm awfully fond of a lot of it. I'm awfully fond of a lot of TNG. I'm awfully fond of much of Voyager. And I'm also, I guess, committed to learning from the failed experiments as well, or the things that I don't like as much. And different characters, different narrative arcs can grow on you, in part through the work of sort of intellectual dialogue and debate. I was pretty sour on Neelix from Voyager until I read David Grevin's excellent book on gender and sexuality in Star Trek, in which he dedicates quite a bit of time to arguing for Neelix as this kind of queer figure, this kind of male mother of the crew, and one who does an awful lot of socially reproductive labor for everybody. Garrett Wang and Robert McNeil on their podcast, The Delta Flyers, recently pointed out, like, is Neelix making 150 meals for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for everybody on the show? And is he the only one in that kitchen? So I mean, I think interpretive community is really valuable in kind of pushing us beyond our immediate preferences and seeing what more there is to be learned. But yes, DS9 is my favorite.
Nice, very good. Yeah, I think that's fascinating to think about. I know that I know that you have one fan out in the big Star Trek universe. I didn't know if you knew this. Una McCormick, the Star Trek writer. She and I know each other through socials, and I mentioned a little while ago that I was trying to negotiate to have you on the show, and she was very excited. So here's my little shout out to Una, who I want to have on as well, but to talk a little bit about New Trek, her perceptions of the new Star Trek universes starting after 2017 with Discovery. But I know that she is a big fan of your work precisely because of the ways in which you start to think about these nuances of relationships and labor in the Star Trek universe. So shout out to Una, shout out to you because of Una's appreciation. So we'll see how that turns out. But I want to get into something that you mentioned just briefly about the working with Star Trek for you is about working with a kind of a set of narratives that positions a certain kind of future possible for humanity. We've talked with a lot of different people on our programs about the vision of Star Trek. And initially when Star Trek started back in the late 1960s, it was described as putting forward this kind of progressive vision of humanity that focused on egalitarianism, a lot of the sort of themes of racial color blindness, for instance. We've had some folks on the program who have then taken a more kind of critical look at Star Trek, the Star Trek universe in general, trying to point out its imperialist themes or its colonial themes, that the Federation is still an empire, right? We have an entire podcast dedicated to this discussion. But the work that you've taken in looking at DS9, it kind of shows that the narrative of DS9 is working with quite a radical politics. I wanted to ask before we delve into DS9, though, do you think that as a whole, the Star Trek universe represents a kind of a radical progressive vision even still today? Or is it, as you said, so vast that it encompasses lots of different kinds of messages? And if so, then how do you pull out that radicalness for your work?
This is a great question, and it's funny because I think every iteration of Star Trek that one is presented with, or when one wants to think about, one has to confront this problem anew, and like stake out a position in these debates on Star Trek's contradictions. So it's kind of an evergreen question, which is valuable. The position I try to stake out in the book is that both the critics and the defenders are right. That Star Trek is both racist and anti-racist, both colonial and anti-colonial, capitalist and anti-capitalist, and so on. And so then our work is kind of to decipher the precise ways in which these things get articulated together. And the good news is that we already have tools for doing that, because the contradictions of rainbow imperialism or racial liberalism, in our own world are already articulating freedom with violence, as Chandan Reddy might put it. So, in the Star Trek universe, we see a federation that is admirable in some ways. It's post-scarcity, it's post-capitalist, but as Dan Hassler-Forrest and others have pointed out, it really rarely fleshes out the democratic work that it would actually take to imagine and organize a different economy. We see relatively egalitarian relationships among human, but a lot of tropes of racial superiority and inferiority end up getting projected onto extraterrestrials. A lot of geopolitical tropes get projected onto extraterrestrials. And what I find valuable about DS9 within the context of that broader universe is that it's questioning the Federation's official stories about itself. From the very beginning, from the pilot episode, Major Kira, is very skeptical of the idea that the Federation is not like other empires, which really resounds with points that I think students of the history of colonization, like Edward Said, have reminded us of in the run up to our own imperial excursions in Iraq and elsewhere. I think DS9 sort of takes measure of the distance between the 1990s US and the kind of possible future utopia imagined by Roddenberry in the 1960s. So it's indexical in a way that remains salient now because so many of the crises that we currently face were really deepened and exacerbated in the 90s.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And it also too would be different, right? I often think about like, we have to sort of keep all of the series in dialogue with one another. That gets complicated with a, almost 60-year now body of work. And if you're only thinking about the canon, which is the films and the TV series, you start thinking about like, well, what if you start introducing novels and novelization into this? That becomes some more such complication. But I do argue in my book that there's a certain kind of coherence in the Star Trek universe that is a progressive vision of moral progress in a certain kind of way that you can get out of it. But I think it's interesting that if somehow we get to the Star Trek World War III and all we're left with in the future is Enterprise, we might have a very sort of different vision of what Star Trek is all about. So even though there are those nuggets of the Star Trek sort of hopefulness, it's hard sometimes to find that in Enterprise. And there have been criticisms about more recent sort of Star Trek with its kind of grim, dark tendencies, whether or not it preserves that kind of progressive vision of the future or not. I think it does, but you have to know what to look for in certain kinds of ways. And in thinking about like a show that you were saying sort of is self-reflective, right? You were saying that DS9 is sort of self-reflective about the Star Trek universe. One show that I found really useful in this kind of way, right, is Lower Decks.
Mm.
Also very self-reflective about the meaning and the sincerity of the Star Trek hopefulness, right? And so I love that show on a variety of different levels, but one, because it gives sort of space and opportunity to ask, like, well, what exactly are the ideals that Star Trek is trying to put forward? And ultimately, I think it tries to reinforce them, but it does, for a careful sort of observer, it starts to make you wonder, like, well, wait a minute, what does Star Trek stand for? And how is it just hokey utopianism, or is there something really that is attainable for humanity? So, um, given all that, what I just said, I wanted to ask you then about the radicalness in the work that you present, right? So you want to say, at least in the question about sort of social justice with racial justice, that there's something important about what DS9 is doing in terms of elevating certain kinds of perspectives about racial justice. And in your book, you talk particularly about the importance of the centrality of the sort of main protagonist, Captain Benjamin Sisko. Um, why is Cisco? Why is this character important to the overall radicality of the DS9 vision? And something else that you argue in the book too is that it's sometimes hard, perhaps, to separate the radicalness of the character from the actor who portrayed the character, Avery Brooks, who, there's a lot of that can be talked about just on him as a really interesting figure, as a political radical
Mhm.
to a certain extent. So I guess the question I want to ask you is, why is Cisco so important? Why is the Cisco really the central the central sort of figure for thinking about racial justice in the Star Trek universe?
Mm, mm. Yeah, he is reluctant at first, but I think Cisco is really the heart and the soul of DS9 in a lot of ways. Although I think he maybe shares in that with Major Kira, who we can talk about later. Benjamin Sisko is, first and foremost, a loving father and a grieving widower. At a time when many representations of Black family are either disparaging or cleft to respectability politics in a way that hasn't aged well, like Cosby. There's a tenderness to Cisco that also intervenes when we think about Deep Space Nine's relationship to Westerns, like the relationship between sci-fi and Westerns, because it was based on the Rifleman, and shows like the Rifleman, which are also about father-son bonds. There's certain places they can't go because of their own attachments to a certain kind of white masculine ideal that Cisco goes in his care for his son Jake. Um, he is the first Black commanding officer to be a protagonist in the Star Trek franchise. And he's also interesting because he has two distinct charges. He is a secular Federation officer who's trying to liaise with Bajor and get Bajor to join the Federation. But he's also emissary of the Bajoran prophets, right? These non-corporeal beings who exist outside of linear space and time. He's emissary to all corporeal beings on their behalf. And with allegiance to the prophets comes sort of special duty to look after Bajor, and Bajor's own interests as distinct from those of the Federation. So in DS9, we see Cisco travel back to 21st century Earth and lead a rebellion against racial capitalism in San Francisco. We see the prophets give him a divine vision that draws extensively and very sympathetically on the experiences of 20th century Black American artists and civil rights activists. But we also see a complex, I think, contradictory image of a Black military leader who reflects back to us some of the frustrations of like military multiculturalism or rainbow imperialism, not unlike a Colin Powell, who he was compared, I think, by Newsweek to Colin Powell at the time the show aired, or even a Barack Obama, right, who has been widely criticized by Black radicals for failing working class people of color and for, in particular, continuing and expanding the global war on terror. I think Avery Brooks is really indispensable to understanding what's so important and brilliant about Cisco. He has, given a number of interviews that I quote from in the book that are incredibly insightful and worth reading in full in their own right. Brooks is incredibly multi-talented. He's an actor, a musician, a director. He was a theater professor at Rutgers for many years. And notably, he played Paul Robeson, the great actor, athlete, musician, and communist activist of the early to mid 20th century. Paul Robeson Sr., he has portrayed him on stage on and off since the late 70s. And in interviews, Brooks situates Cisco always in the context of a centuries-long Black freedom struggle. This is someone who has a really clear sense of race and class politics. Avery Brooks's father was a union steward. And Brooks is someone who's able to give context to Cisco's actions that might not otherwise be obvious to audiences. So Cisco is, even when he's reluctant to have this relationship with the prophets or take up this job at DS9, Cisco sees value in Bajoran religion as a resource for struggle against colonial occupation by the Cardassians. And in interviews, Brooks always links that to the role of spirituality in struggles for freedom across the African diaspora.
Yeah, so he infuses the character there with this sort of richness about liberation struggles that really comes from his sort of personal experience, both in his familial lineage, but also, right, with a deep appreciation of the Black freedom struggle. Yeah. Um, let me ask here, what is the sort of message about racial justice that you think comes out of DS9, if there is one, right? Because part of what I liked about the book is that you sort of link it to the radical vision of Martin Luther King Jr., particularly towards the latter part of King's life, when he started talking about, for instance, the triple evils of militarism, capitalism, and racism. And part of what you say is that DS9 recapitulates, reinforces this message in a kind of way, or echoes this message. Could you talk a little bit about what is that message of MLK? How is it resonating in DS9 for you?
Sure. I think it's sort of threefold, maybe. The first is just this point that religion is a really important resource for nurturing liberation struggle, that it can't be dismissed as more secular iterations of Star Trek sometimes tend to do. And you see that with the prophets, you see that with Cisco's kind of relationship with them and abiding respect for Bajoran's relationship with them. But I think that what that prophetic call, both on Earth and on Bajor, kind of forces us to reckon with is that um, racial and economic justice, which are intertwined within the United States or within the global North, is not sufficient. That sort of the call to sort of love of one's fellow beings, right? That King talks about from the perspective of Black Christianity, requires sort of a global solidarity that requires confronting empire. And requires kind of calling out the evils of one's own empire, even when that empire uses diversity to sort of launder its image, as Melanie McAllister and Cornel West and Keegan Taylor and many others have sort of pointed out. So we get in Cisco someone who is coming up, time after time, against the intertwined character of racism and capitalism within the United States. There's all these details in episodes like Far Beyond the Stars that have to do with like how much is everyone getting paid, and you end up seeing that their rates of pay are differentiated by race and gender. So we're always dealing with kind of race and class together for Cisco. But we're also dealing with empire, right? He is sort of the commander in chief of the Federation's efforts against the Dominion, an enemy that sometimes we take as standing in for somebody else, but might also stand in for a more explicitly imperialist version of ourselves that we as Americans might not want to see. So it's complex. I don't think the allegory is like one to one, like I think in the original series you can sort of say the Klingons are like the USSR and it's all kind of scrambled in DS9, but I think that scrambling is productive insofar as it forces us to confront the relationships between struggles that usually get bracketed as domestic to the nation, and to see that those struggles are profoundly connected with those between colonizer and colonized, or between North and South.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this actually raises the next question that I wanted to talk to you about. One of the things that you really explore and take quite seriously is the question of the Bajoran occupation by the Cardassians. Um, so one of your chapters goes into talking about why the setting, DS9 taking place, after the liberation of Bejor, after many decades of being occupied by the enemy Cardassians. You think that this is key in some sense to the politics of DS9, and that the struggles of Kira Nerys are really important to sort of understand, in some sense, the dynamics of decolonization. So, what can you explain a little bit about why you think the setting shortly after the Bajoran occupation is so important to the kind of radical lessons of DS9?
Sure. So DS9, like you say, presents us with a world that is being rebuilt after 50 years of colonial occupation, and after occupation has been defeated through armed struggle. The Cardassian occupation of Bajor killed between 5 and 15 million Bajorans. And Cardassian resource extraction has also devastated Bajoran land on a number of the continents on the planet. The prophets are a really crucial source of support and guidance in Bejor's liberation struggle. And so, given that mix of events and dynamics, it's not surprising that people have read the Bajorans as allegorizing a wide range of conflicts. And writers themselves have said, yes, we were thinking about a wide range of conflicts. So the experience of genocide very clearly links to European Jews during the Holocaust, to Native Americans, to the experience of Bosnian Muslims that was kind of contemporaneous with the show, and to the ongoing genocide of Palestinians. And so in the existing scholarship, only one of those interpretations is really well developed or sustained in any way. They're all alluded to frequently. Even the New York Times has said that the Bajorans are the Palestinians of outer space. But it's only the interpretation of Bajor as an allegory for the experience of European Jews during the Holocaust that's been developed, like that has whole articles developed to it, for instance. And rightly so. That's an incredibly important and well-supported and morally urgent, line of interpretation. What I sought to do in the book was to complement that existing work on the Holocaust by developing an extended reading of Bajor as Palestine. And I think the lessons from that reading are sort of three. One is has to do with the significance of place and land in struggles against settler colonialism. In Culture and Imperialism, Edward Said reminds us that being able to imagine geography differently is the key to anti-imperialist struggle, because imperialism has actually carved up land and given it new names and has made that seem, inevitable. DS9 got flack actually from some left critics for being place-based, as opposed to depicting the Bajorans as a kind of sympathetic displaced people. But because we know, right, settler colonialism isn't over. Like, there are many places that are under occupation today. And so is there something sort of naively utopian about imagining a post-colonial moment? But I think the advantage of imagining that post-colonial moment is that it gets us thinking about the politics of place in a different way. TNG tended to depict the Bajorans only as displaced people, only in the diaspora. And I think DS9 is able to complement that by raising questions about what does it mean to rebuild place after occupation ends. I think being able to imagine that work of rebuilding is important, and you see that in the work of anti-colonial scholars like Fanon. They're trying to always imagine, okay, what's beyond anti-colonial nationalism? Because we know that is only a phase, and if we get mired in that phase, it leads to its own kinds of exploitations and inequalities that people like Fanon are very wary of. The second, I think, lesson from reading Bajor as a stand-in for Palestine has to do, again, with the significance of religion in anti-colonial struggle. Because we see in characters ranging from like Kai Wynn to Major Kira to Vedek Bareil that all these people are devoutly religious, but their articulations of religion are bound up with very different kinds of politics. And so, just as there's a tendency on the left to look askance at place-based politics, there's a tendency to look askance, I think, at religion. And I think the devil is really in the details, and that we kind of have to put our thinking caps on and be curious rather than assuming in advance that place-based politics are inward-looking, or religiously inflected politics are reactionary. I think that's too easy. And also potentially limits us from possible coalitions that might need to be built. Um, the third lesson of reading Bejor as a stand-in for Palestine, and for the experience of Indigenous peoples more broadly, is one we learn more from sort of the reception of this storyline. And that reception teaches us that oppressed people are incredibly inventive in their ability to get sustenance from limited or frustrating or problematic cultural resources. So we know that most Bajorans on DS9 were played by white actors, but on my book tour, I've been able to be in conversation with people like Kelly Hayes, the great Menominee writer and organizer who lives in Chicago. And she talks about how she was immediately able to see in the Bajoran something relevant to her own experience as an Indigenous woman, and also something calling her to solidarity with Palestine as a child before she knew much about that conflict, and when everything that she'd been presented about it was very anti-Palestine. So I don't think we can underestimate the power of allegory, even when it's limited and flawed, to be appropriated back by marginalized people and read for sort of imaginative resources for liberation.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I think that what's interesting too about the way in which the aftermath of the occupation is presented is you often are told stories in flashback kinds of ways of the multitude of different ways in which people survived and resisted the occupation, and really, complicates. I think for me, what I like about the story is it complicates the kind of ways in which we talk about what forms liberation takes. When we're thinking about like permanent revolution or permanent revolution against colonialism, what does that look like? And you start to, in the presentation of various flashbacks, you see different ways in which people might have had to engage in different kinds of ways to survive and to resist. And it's not just simply a matter of violent, nonviolent resistance in various ways. Subtle kinds of cultural resistance are often portrayed, and then some really sort of grim kinds of storylines about the Bajoran sex trafficking that was
Mhm.
going on. Some very, very hard hitting stuff. Um, so, there's a lot of different kinds of, as you mentioned, there's a lot of different kinds of storylines that are drawn from myriad different kinds of occupation struggles. Um, I mean, this is a difficult question to ask, I think, not only for our time where we are today, but just working with allegory like this for political discussion. Are there any lessons that DS9 has in its story about the occupation of Bejor that we can think about today for our theorizing and thinking about settler colonialism and occupation today, particularly if, right, Bejor is a stand-in for Palestine. What does it mean about Palestine today, if anything at all? Do you
Mhm.
have any reflections about that?
I think it's a really important question. I think that in Major Kira, we get someone who is able to really articulately expound on how Bajoran life, and we might say by parallel or by analogy, by extension, Palestinian life, has been so saturated with violence structurally and in ordinary life that even if we disagree, with the choice to use violence in response to settler colonialism, I don't think we can ignore the context that produces that. Talal Assad teaches us, and I think Kira would agree, that the difference between the terrorist and the soldier often is the uniform. um, and so I say that as someone who is opposed to violence against civilians in any form, but as someone who is also a student of history and is also curious about what the conditions that generate that violence. And I think that it is important always to hold our analyses of individual morality and ethics in tension with a structural understanding of intersocietal dynamics. Now, I don't have a blueprint for what that means, But I can say that I am giving I'm dividing the book's royalties between three different community organizations, but one of them is Jewish Voice for Peace, which I think is doing incredibly important work, not just in calling for a ceasefire now, to stop the killing of Palestinian civilians, because we know that the horrible things that happened on October 7th have become a pretext for the killing of, almost 20,000 now Palestinian civilians. But to imagine a future in which Palestine is free and in which Muslims, Christians, and Jews can peaceably coexist in what we now call Israel, in some sort of arrangement, to provide for what Judith Butler calls ethical cohabitation.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah.
No, thank you for that. I think that that's really important, particularly this lesson of thinking about individual morality and structural injustice in our minds together complicates all of those conversations in important ways, so that we don't come to simplistic ideological solutions. And I think that what I like about what you said too is that I know this that. Um, Ira Bear talking about the sort of initial thinking about DS9 when it came out in the early 1990s was right after the Rodney King riots and the destruction of Los Angeles uh, in that in those uprisings. And part of what they were concerned with throughout the series was how to envision rebuilding. So in some sense, a lot of the themes in DS9, now I'm sorry to see more with what you've said and what you've written, is that there's a very big emphasis on questions about restorative, reparative, transformative justice that's coming out of DS9 in a way that's not so much, or is not forefronted as much in some of the other episodes or other series. I mean, so I think that there's a uniqueness in DS9 because of that, and the way that it tells its stories, that is particularly relevant for our world today, like that.
Absolutely. I think this is why ideas matter, because we're compelled to respond to violence, but the ideas that we use to take measure of violence are part of what inform and guide our response. So if we see something like October 7th as violence, but not something like the occupation as violence, we miss out. I don't think that makes Hamas's actions okay, but I do think it informs our response to violence.
Yeah, and just to say too, I think that this is something I say in my book. This was the message that King was talking about towards the end of his life too. Was that when we talk about violence, violent responses like riots, urban riots in the cities, we can't really talk about condemning those without, of course, taking into account those kinds of structural injustices. So there is a kind of legacy of this kind of way of thinking that is still relevant for us today, but was relevant 60 years ago in some of the most, sort of um, um, complicated uprisings in the United States as well. Yeah. No, thank you for that. Um, I wanted to talk about one of the other big things. There's several themes that we're not going to get a chance to talk about. One of the other that I thought was really, really incisive and interesting was the ways in which you delved into identity exploration in DS9, and particularly the way in which DS9, not sure what to say, embraces or at least started to investigate, started to point to the exploration of queer identity, particularly in the characters of, say, Dax, particularly Jadzia, right? Jadzia Dax, and Garrick, right? Who, Garrick is now, there's this whole sort of universe of memes of the friends of Garrick, right? What does Garrick stand for in these kinds of ways? So, it was one of these shows that started to explore possible queer relationships, queer identity, in ways that have sort of been picked up more so in new Trek, have been normalized in newer Trek, particularly in Discovery. Um, but I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about the way in which you talk about the exploration of queer identity starting in DS9, how it might have been radical for that era, right? The early to mid 1990s, And is it still radical today in terms of the ways in which it talks about identity in that kind of sense? So, what can we learn about the characters of Jadzia Dax, for instance, and Garrick from all of this for our sort of struggles continuing for uh, uh, equality of different kinds of queer identities?
Mm, mm, yeah. I mean, I think it's important to note the context as you do. This is the era of bipartisan support for the Defense of Marriage Act. This is the era of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And the episode Rejoined comes out 18 months to the day before the coming out episode on Ellen. This is an era before Will and Grace, like even these limited liberal white forms of representation that queer theorists can critique 6 ways from Sunday. This is before all of that. So, yes, if we look to DS9 for explicitly queer text, on a kind of identitarian basis, we're surely going to be disappointed. But if we look to it for queer allegory, for queer subtext, and for queer experience, as David Grevin points out, we don't actually have to look very hard or very far to be rewarded. Um, so in Rejoined, we get a really powerful allegory for taboos on homosexuality and an achingly beautiful story about love and about loss. Avery Brooks directed this episode, in addition to acting in it. And he took a lot of care to support and protect Terry Farrell and Susanna Thompson as they were getting ready to depict their relationship. And I think it shows in the quality of the work they do in that episode. In interviews, Garrick, or Andrew Robinson, who has played Garrick, has said that he did not ask permission. He just went into his audition and decided to portray Garrick as lusting after Dr. Bashir from day one. And Robinson also went on to write a licensed Trek novel about Garrick that makes him canonically bisexual. So what I find interesting and what I think is so brilliant about these queer allegories is that they show us queer people who are definitely loved and definitely lovable, and who are also problematic, who are also inheritors of different kinds of colonial power and privilege in various forms, and who invite us to reckon with queer complicity and queer delight at once. So, Dax, if we think to whatever extent the Federation has its own imperial shenanigans going on, then I think the fact that Dax used to be in a previous life a Federation ambassador to the Klingons, that's a geopolitically complex kind of inheritance, right? Garrick certainly is an agent of Cardassian imperial power through and through. But I think those more sophisticated forms of representation are so urgent and so that you can be complex and not simply a demon or simply a hero. That's actually much more useful and much more sort of humanizing, if you will, than stereotypical stock images, or sort of images that really cling to respectability politics.
Are you much of a watcher of more recent Trek like Discovery? So
Mhm.
I'm just wondering, is there a difference in the way in which DS9, for instance, made allegorical reference to queer identity, and into the way in which, for instance, something like Discovery tries to normalize queer identity, queer relationships, and so forth? Have we come a long way from DS9 uh, uh, in representations like this?
I mean, I think that the representations that we get in the newer treks of gender and sexual diversity are to be saluted, especially in a moment when in so much of the country those identities are under attack. I mean, one of the great things about media is that it circulates in ways that can give people validation. I think that for me, the tension with some, not all of the newer tracks, and I should qualify this by saying that I always want to defer to people who've studied these things more closely than I have, because I have not given like book level attention to any of the new shows. I've just enjoyed them as a mostly casual viewer. But Women at Warp, the podcast, another excellent science fiction podcast, just did an episode on the tensions between diversity and progressivism and how sometimes you get one and not the other. So like my questions about discovery have much more to do with the overall geopolitical storylines. And scholars like Fiona Davidson, I think, have raised really important questions about, is this just rainbow imperialism? But on the level of characterization and on the level of diverse casting, I think those shows are phenomenal. And I think, by all accounts, like Sonequa Martin Green is just a wonderful person who strikes a really important collegial and everybody counts, everybody matters kind of tone on set. So I think it's complex, So you salute the diversity and then you raise the questions about what material is this amazingly beautiful and diverse and talented cast and crew of characters, being given to sort of act on.
Right. I think that there's some similarities between the ways in which race was treated in the 1960s. Right. There's a future portrayed in which certain kinds of racial dynamics are just sort of normalized, so that there's a color blindness uh, that exists in the Star Trek universe of like the original series, but not much discussion about like how we got there. Like, how did we overcome white supremacy and racial dynamics to get to a place in which the kind of diverse representation is normalized, and what does that mean? And is it just, as you're putting it, rainbow imperialism, or is there something deeper being said about the ways in which different voices come together to work together to build something anew? Like, what would that mean? And that's one of those tensions and contradictions, I think. And it does raise questions. I mean, one of my favorite characters of Discovery, Wilson Cruz, Dr. Culber, right? An amazing actor, so talented, a great political voice on Twitter. I follow him. Amazingly hot, I could say, by the way, too, as a person. But he the character of Dr. Culver, right, is a married gay man, but also has indicated that there's an important kind of Latinx identity that's part of that character. So there's a lot of interesting kind of intersectionality being built into these characters nowadays. But I think ultimately there's a good question that you raise, is like, so what is this representation for and in the service of in the greater sort of picture? And is that being investigated in any kinds of ways? And so that sort of is still an ongoing thing. But I think no doubt the more sort of intersectional diversity of representation is something to be welcomed about newer representation. And I think, I'll say this, and maybe we can pick this up in another time. I was talking about the self-reflexivity of Lower Decks. I think Lower Decks starts to, not only does it normalize a lot of sort of queer identity, in various ways, but it also starts to raise questions about the kind of imperialism that the Federation might represent in ways. And so I think there's a lot of material to sort of take a look there more seriously as well. But that raises this question for me that I want to know about. So, your book came out this year, A Different Trek. Are you going to continue in Trek academics? Where do you go from here? What's your next project? What's your work looking like? And does it involve continuing these kinds of investigations about Star Trek?
This is a great question. I have some papers under review, so I shouldn't say too much in case the reviewers end up listening. But I will say that I'm very interested in the cultural politics of Western classical music and Star Trek. And there's been a lot of criticism of the way that glorifies the achievements of Western Civ, and I agree with the criticism, but I also think that music has its own histories and trajectories of protest and dissent, and so it might be interesting to sort of tease that out a little bit more. I have another paper that is taking up this question of what does it mean to seek justice for Harry Kim, right? This is an Asian American man who many fans rightly lament is perpetually denied a promotion and a girlfriend. And so I think the question becomes, can we respond to the ways in which that character is deprived, while also challenging kind of heteronormative masculinist ideas about what it means to be a good man or a full man? And there's a long line of rich debate in Asian American studies and feminist and queer studies within Asian American studies that provides us insight in thinking about Harry Kim in a different way. And then the last one, actually the one that isn't under review, because I'm still working on it, is about the politics of set location. And what does it mean to film a sympathetic story about homelessness in a neighborhood that has a lot of both public and private security dedicated to criminalizing and containing unhoused people precisely so that film shoots can happen. And is there a gap between narrative and the sort of progressive narrative and some of the conditions of production that actually require people to be confined? So I'm just beginning to try to work through some of that. But beyond those articles, I'm not sure. I think my heart is calling me in other directions, but I think right, best laid plans,
Right. No, fascinating. So a little bit of Star Trek, perhaps, at least, perhaps maybe not necessarily book length level investigations against, but some sort of investigations going on.
Definitely.
Very cool. Well, Dr. Seitz, I want to say thank you very much for talking with me. I really have enjoyed your book. The book is A Different Trek, Radical Geographies of Deep Space Nine, published this year by University of Nebraska Press. And if you are a DS9 fan, I think that you are it's well worth for you to sort of deepen your appreciation with this book. But I want to thank you for your time. And if folks want to get a hold of you, we can sort of put some of your contact information in our notes. But I want to say much thanks and really appreciate your time, and thanks for your work.
Thank you for yours. And I guess rather than the classic "live long and prosper," I'll end with "walk with the prophets."
Oh, that's a good one. That's a good one. Thank you very much. And thank you all for sticking around with us. And please, if you have any thoughts about the geopolitics of DS9 or the Star Trek universe in general, please leave us some comments. Send us some DMs. You can find the Anarres Project throughout the social media world. We're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, we're on X, formerly Twitter. We are on Blue Sky now, just starting off there. We do have some codes perhaps to give away. And we're also on Mastodon, a variety of different places. Oh, and we're on Threads too, I forgot. We're everywhere. So you can get a hold of us in a lot of different places. But please let us know what you think about our work. And if you have any thoughts about Dr. Seitz's investigations into the radicality of DS9, let us know. So thanks very much for listening, and tune in once again very soon. Live long and prosper, Dr. Seitz.
Walk with the prophets.